Pause, obey. Prosper, trusting God's timing in life, faith, and business. Written by Bello. Narrated by Julie. Introduction from Flat D, West London. Scene setting 10:30 p.m. Blocked nose. Audiobook upload fails. Key message: this book is about obedience, not just faith. Suggestion: add a short story from a challenging day in your life that illustrates waiting on God. Reflection prompt: invite readers to journal their expectations versus God's timing. Chapter 1. The Whisper of Not Today. It was 10:30 p.m. in my small living room in West London. I sat in my chair, nose blocked from weeks of relentless hay fever, staring at my laptop. For the fifth, maybe sixth time, I had tried to upload my audiobook. I watched the little bar crawl across the screen, only for the dreaded error message to appear again. Frustration boiled in me. I had done everything right. The file was formatted correctly. My Wi-Fi was working. I had prepared the content, carved out the time, even pushed myself past exhaustion just to make it happen. But it wouldn't. In the silence of my frustration, I remembered something. Earlier that day, I had felt the gentle whisper of the Holy Spirit. Not today. I had ignored it. I thought maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was being lazy. Maybe not today was just my tiredness speaking. And so I pushed ahead, determined to prove I could still show up, still deliver, still keep the momentum alive. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't my best work. I was drained, unfocused, and moving in my own strength rather than God's. And suddenly it clicked. This wasn't about faith. This was about obedience. Faith versus obedience. Faith says, I believe God will do it. Obedience says, even if I don't see it today, I will still follow. Faith is often loud, it gets celebrated. We hear stories of people stepping out in faith, believing for miracles, and achieving what seemed impossible. Faith fills testimonies and Instagram captions. But obedience is quiet. It happens behind closed doors. It rarely trends, and yet it carries the weight of intimacy with God. That night, I wasn't being asked to believe harder. I was being asked to surrender deeper. Biblical insight. Saul's disobedience. The story of King Saul in 1 Samuel 15 comes to mind. God gave Saul specific instructions through the prophet Samuel to completely destroy the Amalekites and their possessions. But Saul thought partial obedience was enough. He spared what he thought was valuable and justified it as a sacrifice to God. When Samuel confronted him, he spoke words that still cut deep today. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. 1 Samuel 15:22 NIV. Saul thought faith and sacrifice would cover his disobedience. But God was looking for obedience, not activity. That night in my living room, I realized I was being Saul. I wanted to sacrifice my energy, my late-night hustle, my tired devotional in the name of showing up. But God wasn't asking for my effort. He was asking for my obedience. Business connection. When pushing hurts, the visioners entrepreneurs were taught to hustle. Push harder. Don't stop. Keep grinding. And there's truth in perseverance. But sometimes, obedience looks like restraint. In my own journey with IQK and Mercy Elroi, I've seen this repeatedly. There were moments I wanted to launch a product or announce a service simply because it looked like the right time. I didn't want to lose momentum. I wanted to prove I was progressing, but launching at the wrong time, even with the right product, can sabotage the vision. Obedience means aligning with God's timing, even when it doesn't make sense. It's choosing to pause when the world screams go. It's pulling back when your pride says, prove yourself. That night, by closing my laptop and refusing to post the audiobook, I wasn't giving up. I was giving in to God's better plan. Reflection questions: can you recall a time when you pushed forward against God's whisper of not today? What was the outcome? In what areas of your life do you confuse faith with obedience? Are you more focused on keeping momentum than on keeping alignment with God? Action steps: pause and listen. Before making your next decision, whether personal or business, ask, is this faith or is this obedience? Write down the difference you sense. Identify a not today area. Choose one part of your life where you know God is saying wait. Commit to surrendering it this week. Practice restraint instead of posting, producing, or pushing. Practice stillness once this week. Journal what you hear in the silence. That night in flat D, I learned the power of a whispered not today. It wasn't God shutting me down. It was God inviting me deeper into trust, because sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't moving forward. It's standing still. Chapter 2: The Difference Between Faith and Obedience. Not long after that night in my living room, I found myself wrestling again, not with technology this time, but with my own expectations of God. I had prayed for clarity about the direction of one of my businesses. I wanted to know whether to take a deal that looked promising but felt heavy in my spirit. On paper, it seemed like the answer to prayer. The numbers worked. The people involved looked credible. My faith said, God can bless this. He can turn it around for good. But in my heart, I felt unsettled. And then I understood. This wasn't about faith. It was about obedience. Faith would have me believe that God could make the deal work. Obedience required me to walk away, even if it meant explaining to others why I passed up a good opportunity. That moment stung. Faith was easier to explain. Obedience was harder to justify. Faith versus obedience. Faith and obedience are like two sides of the same coin, but they are not interchangeable. Faith is belief, confidence in God's ability. Obedience is surrender, alignment with God's instruction. Faith trusts God's power. Obedience trusts God's heart. Faith looks forward to the promise. Obedience bows to the process. Biblical insight: Abraham's journey. Abraham's life teaches us this distinction. When God told him he would be the father of many nations, Abraham needed faith to believe it, even though his body was as good as dead and Sarah's womb was barren. But when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, the son of promise, that required obedience, faith said, I believe God will give me a son. Obedience said, even if he asks for the son back, I will trust him. The two worked together, but it was obedience that proved the depth of Abraham's faith. Business connection: the illusion of momentum in business. We often lean heavily on faith. I believe this product will sell. I believe God will provide the funding. I believe doors will open. And yes, faith fuels vision. Without it, no entrepreneur would dare to dream. But obedience is where sustainability lives. Obedience is showing up consistently when no one claps. Obedience is declining the investor who doesn't align with your values, even when money is tight. Obedience is restructuring your business model because God is leading you to build something bigger than your initial plan. Faith starts the journey. Obedience keeps you aligned along the way. Reflection questions: where in your life are you walking by faith but neglecting obedience? Can you think of a time when obedience cost you something in the short term but preserved you in the long term? How do you discern the difference between exercising faith and practicing obedience? Action steps: journal the difference. Write down one current situation where you are exercising faith. Then ask, what does obedience require of me here? Obedience inventory. List 3 areas in your business or personal life where you sense God calling you to obedience, not just faith. Surrender prayer. Pray specifically over one of those areas, asking God for strength to obey even when it doesn't make sense. Faith says, God will. Obedience says, I will. And when the two walk together, purpose unfolds. Chapter 3. A Full Day. A still night. That day was full from start to finish. I had a development meeting for iMentor Pro with Mr. A and Mr. G. Then I rushed to the salon, got my hair done, had my eyebrows shaped. From there, it was a quick stop at DPD, later church, then picking up Princess. And somehow, in between it all, I bought a blank canvas, because a small part of me still longed to paint again with words. By evening, I was drained. But instead of resting, I sat down at my laptop to push through another task. I told myself, this is what productivity looks like. This is how momentum is built. This is discipline. But when nothing worked and I sat there in silence, I realized something. Stillness is worship too. The trap of busyness. We live in a culture that glorifies busyness. If you're not constantly producing, posting, moving, hustling, you feel behind. Even in ministry and business, the pressure to stay visible can drown out the whisper of God. But productivity is not always obedience, and momentum is not always movement. That night, God reminded me, my worth is not measured by output. Biblical insight. Mary and Martha, Luke 10:30, 8:42. Jesus visits the home of two sisters. Martha is busier serving, preparing, fussing over details. Mary simply sits at Jesus' feet, listening to him. Martha grows frustrated and demands Jesus tell Mary to help. But Jesus replies, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Luke 10:41-42 NIV. Martha was productive. Mary was obedient. Sometimes we are so busy serving God that we forget to sit with him. Business connection. Hustle versus alignment in business. Hustle is celebrated. The grind never stops. Sleep later. No days off. But hustle without alignment is noise. Obedience sometimes looks like pausing, resting, waiting, listening. It feels counterintuitive, especially when deadlines loom and competition moves fast. But a business birthed from obedience carries a peace that hustle never can. When I look back at the ventures God has truly blessed, whether Kuke or Mercy, Elroi, they didn't grow because I worked around the clock. They grew because I paused long enough to listen, to shift, to follow God's leading. Reflection questions. Do you equate productivity with obedience? Where in your life have you been more Martha than Mary? What would it look like for you to embrace stillness as a form of worship? Action steps. Schedule stillness. Block 30 minutes this week for silence before God. No phone, no tasks, no agenda. Redefine productivity. Write down one area in your life or business where obedience might mean doing less, not more. Mary Martha. Check each day. Ask yourself, am I sitting at his feet today or just serving in his house? That night, my body was tired, but my spirit was reminded, obedience isn't always about action. Sometimes it's about restraint. Sometimes it's about choosing stillness over striving. Because in the still night, God speaks louder than in the busiest day. Chapter 4. The Carried Faith. That morning, before my long day began, my devotion spoke about prayer partners. The scripture was one I had read before, but this time it came alive in a new way. It was the story of the paralytic man in Mark 2:1-12. He couldn't walk to Jesus on his own. his friends carried him. When the crowd blocked their way, they climbed the roof, tore it open, and lowered him down. And then the line that shook me: when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Mark 2-5. Niv, the man, was healed, not because of his own strength, but because of the faith and obedience of his friends. That story stopped me in my tracks. The power of community we often hear: you need more faith. But sometimes you just need good friends. You may not have the strength to pray. You may not have the energy to believe. You may not have the courage to break through the roof. But if you are surrounded by the right people, they will carry you. And here's the truth: if you want people to carry you in prayer when you are weak, you must first be willing to carry others. Personal reflection: that day, I realized I hadn't always let people carry me. As a founder, as a woman, as someone used to leading, I often felt I had to stand strong on my own. Vulnerability felt risky. Admitting weakness felt like failure. But God was showing me: sometimes obedience is letting yourself be carried, and sometimes obedience is showing up to carry someone else. Biblical insight: shared burdens, Paul writes in Galatians 6:2-2. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Obedience is not just vertical between you and God, it is also horizontal, expressed in how you love and support others. The paralytic man had no movement, no mobility, no direct way to reach Jesus. His breakthrough required community, business connection, who carries you. In business and entrepreneurship, independence is glorified. We admire the self-made founder. But the truth is, no one builds alone. Behind every founder is a mentor who carried them with wisdom, a friend who carried them with encouragement, a client who carried them with trust. When I reflect on Ikoke and Mercy Elroi, I see the people who carried me, sometimes with prayer, sometimes with advice, sometimes with introductions or resources. Without them, I would still be at the door, blocked by the crowd. As founders, we must ask, who is carrying us? Who are we carrying? Because the people around you are either lifting you toward Jesus or keeping you stuck at the door. Reflection questions: who has carried you in prayer, encouragement, or support when you couldn't move forward on your own? When was the last time you carried someone else through their struggle? Do you allow yourself to be vulnerable enough to be carried, or do you resist help? Action steps: identify your carriers. Write down the names of 3 people you know you can call for prayer or support. Reach out and thank them this week. Be a carrier. Choose one person in your circle to intentionally lift up, whether in prayer, encouragement, or practical help. Build partnership. If you don't have prayer partners, ask God to bring people into your life who will carry you, and commit to being that person for others. That morning devotion reminded me, you don't always need more faith. Sometimes you just need more obedience. The obedience to let others carry you, and the humility to carry someone else. Because in the kingdom of God, breakthroughs are rarely solo journeys. They are carried through community. Chapter 5. Choosing obedience over output. That night in my living room, I stared at my laptop one last time. I could have forced it. I could have uploaded that audiobook in some half-baked way just to say I did it. I could have ticked the box, posted online, and kept the illusion of momentum alive. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't obedience. It was pride. So I closed the laptop. And in that small act, I made a choice. Obedience over output. The illusion of progress. We live in a world obsessed with output. How many posts have you made? How many sales did you close? How many hours did you grind? But output doesn't always equal obedience. And busyness doesn't always equal fruitfulness. Obedience sometimes looks like slowing down. Obedience sometimes looks like saying no to good things, so you can say yes to the God thing. That night, the most productive thing I did was nothing at all, because nothing was exactly what God asked of me. Biblical insight. Gethsemane. When Jesus knelt in Gethsemane, the weight of the cross before him, he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Matthew 26-39. NIV. Faith could have said, "God will rescue me." But obedience said, "Not my will, but yours." It wasn't output that saved humanity. It was obedience. Personal reflection. As a founder, I've been guilty of worshipping output. There were seasons when I believed success was in the constant producing, mails, posts, pitches, meetings. I thought if I just did more, I could force breakthrough. But the truth is, I've experienced more peace and provision when I've paused to listen than when I've produced out of pressure. Some of my best business shifts didn't come from hustling, came from moments of stillness where God whispered a new direction. Business connection. The cost of wrong timing in business. Releasing something too soon can do more damage than waiting. A rushed launch, an untested service, an ill-timed pitch, it all creates unnecessary setbacks. I've learned that obedience often protects us from ourselves. When God says, "Not today," it's not rejection, it's preservation, it's alignment. Output might look good in the short term, but obedience bears fruit in the long term. Reflection questions. Do you ever confuse output with obedience? How can you think of a time when you pushed something forward just to look productive? What was the outcome? What area of your life or business needs less output and more obedience right now? Action steps. Audit your output. Review what you've been producing recently. Ask, did God ask me to do this? Or did I do it to prove something? Set an obedience goal. Instead of an output goal this week, posts, emails, sales. Set one obedience goal, something small that God has placed on your heart. Pause before posting. Before your next launch, post or push. Pause and ask God, is this obedience or just output? That night, in flat D, I realized obedience may not be measurable in metrics, but it is visible in alignment. An alignment with God is more valuable than any output the world could applaud. Because when your life and work flow from obedience, fruitfulness will always follow, even if not today. Chapter 6. Obedience as the language of trust. Sometime after that, not today night, I found myself reflecting on why obedience feels so heavy. Faith in many ways feels lighter. It's hopeful, it's inspiring. You can tell people, "I'm believing God for this," and they'll cheer you on. Faith feels like vision boards, affirmations, and declarations. But obedience feels like surrender. It feels like letting go of control, giving up your timeline, and trusting God's timing even when nothing makes sense. And that's when it clicked. Obedience is the language of trust. Trust in the waiting. When I look at my journey with IK, I can honestly say it hasn't been my hustle that kept it alive. There were months I didn't know how the business would continue, times I thought it was over. But then unexpectedly partnerships opened, clients came, and opportunities found me. It wasn't my doing, it was God's hand, and every time I wanted to push harder, God whispered, "Trust me, not today." Faith told me He could do it. Obedience required me to wait until He said now. Biblical insight. Noah's Ark. Think of Noah. God told him to build an ark when there was no rain in sight. It wasn't faith alone that sustained him, it was obedience. Faith believed the flood would come. Obedience kept hammering wood day after day, year after year, when everyone laughed. That was trust in action. Personal reflection. I realized I sometimes trusted my hustle more than I trusted God. I thought if I just kept moving, kept producing, I could prove my faith. But faith without obedience is incomplete. Obedience forces us to lay down pride and admit, God, I don't know best. You do. And that's trust. Business connection. When hustle isn't enough, in entrepreneurship, hustle is glorified. But hustle without trust burns you out. Some of the hardest decisions in business aren't about working harder. They're about waiting longer, waiting for the right partner, waiting for the right time to launch, waiting for clarity instead of rushing into the next shiny idea. It's countercultural. Investors want speed. Customers want now. The market wants constant innovation. But obedience requires us to sometimes step out of the world's rhythm and trust God's timing instead. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Reflection questions. Do you find it easier to have faith in God's power than to trust His timing? Where are you relying on hustle instead of trust? What does obedience look like for you in this current season? Action, steps, trust, test. Write down one area where you are tempted to make it happen in your own strength. Pray over it and release it into God's timing. Replace hustle with trust. When you feel the urge to rush something, pause and ask, am I moving out of fear or obedience? Declare it each morning this week. Say out loud, obedience is my trust language with God. That's what obedience is. Trust lived out loud. It may not be glamorous, it may not trend, but it builds an intimacy with God that faith alone cannot, because faith says, I believe you can. Obedience says, I trust you enough to wait. Chapter 7. The quiet strength of obedience. Obedience doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't always come with fireworks or instant results. Obedience is quiet, but in its quietness lies a strength that sustains far beyond applause. That night in West London, nobody clapped for me when I shut down my laptop. Nobody celebrated my choice to stop forcing an upload. In fact, the world would have said I failed, I didn't meet my own deadline. But heaven saw it differently. Because obedience isn't about visibility. It's about alignment. The power of hidden seasons. There are seasons in business, in ministry, in life where your obedience feels invisible. You're sowing seeds, but no fruit appears. You're praying prayers, but no answer comes. You're showing up, but no one notices. And in those hidden seasons, obedience is tested, but it's also strengthened. Think of David. Before he was king, he was a shepherd in the field, alone, hidden, forgotten by people, but not by God. It was in the quiet obedience of protecting sheep that God prepared him to protect a nation. Biblical insight. The widow's oil into Kings 4. A widow came to Elisha in desperation. Her husband had died, and her sons were about to be taken as slaves. She had nothing but a small jar of oil. Elisha told her to collect jars from her neighbors, not just a few. Then, in obedience, she poured out what little she had, quietly, privately, no audience, and in that hidden act of obedience, her oil multiplied until every jar was filled. Personal reflection. Some of my most pivotal business decisions weren't made in meetings, but in moments of quiet prayer. No social media announcement, no newsletter blast. Just me, God, and a whisper. Not today. Wait. Trust. Those quiet obediences didn't trend, but they built my foundation, and I've come to realize true strength isn't in how loud you shout about your faith. It's in how quietly you live your obedience. Business connection. Silent seeds. Lasting harvest. When building IQK, There were long stretches where no one outside my circle saw the work being done. They didn't see the late-night strategy sessions, the endless pitch revisions, the hard conversations, or the quiet waiting for contracts to close. But those hidden seasons mattered. They built resilience. They trained me to trust God over the numbers. They reminded me that strength isn't measured in noise, it's measured in endurance. Just like the widow's oil, the strength of obedience multiplies in silence. Reflection. Questions: where, in your life, are you in a hidden season of obedience? Do you struggle with the silence of waiting? Why or why not? How can you begin to value quiet obedience as much as visible faith? Action steps: silent surrender. Take one action of obedience this week that no one knows about but God. Journal the hidden work. Write down ways God has been shaping you in silence. These are seeds of strength. Shift perspective. Instead of resenting hidden seasons, thank God for the quiet strength they build. Quiet obedience doesn't trend. It won't always be noticed by people, but it is never wasted with God, because strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, still here, still trusting, still obedient. Chapter 8. Not today doesn't mean never by now. I had learned a powerful truth. Not today does not mean never. Sitting in my living room, still blocked nose, still tired, still waiting, I realized that God's delays aren't denials. They are alignments. They are preparations. They are invitations to trust beyond what we can see. That audiobook I didn't post. It will come out when the time is right. IQK and Mercy Elroi continue to thrive not because of my hustle, but because of God's timing. Every delay, every not today has its purpose. The patience of obedience teaches patience. It strips away pride. It refines purpose. Faith may bring hope, but obedience builds character. Obedience shapes a heart that can endure the waiting, the uncertainty, and the unseen victories. Just like Joseph in Egypt, sold into slavery, falsely accused, forgotten in prison, he trusted God's process, even when the timeline seemed impossible. His obedience through waiting prepared him to save nations. Business connection. Timing over hustle. Entrepreneurs often fear that delays mean failure. Investors, clients, deadlines, they pressure us to act fast. But sometimes patience and obedience are far more strategic than speed. When God says not today, it is not a rejection. It is a redirection. It is an opportunity to refine your work, strengthen your vision, and prepare for a harvest that aligns with His timing. As founders, learning to pause, listen, and obey is often the difference between short-term success and long-term sustainability. Reflection questions. How do you usually respond when God says, not today? Can you identify a delay that ended up being a blessing in disguise? What would it look like to embrace not today as part of God's plan, rather than a setback? Action steps. Reframe delays. Write down one area of your life or business where God has said, not today. Ask Him to reveal the purpose in the pause. Commit to trust each morning this week. Remind yourself, not today does not mean never. I trust God's timing. Celebrate obedience. Reflect on one act of obedience, even a small one that required patience. Thank God for it. Closing reflection from my little living room in West London. I have come to understand this. Obedience might not be loud. It might not go viral. It might not trend on social media. But obedience is where God checks the heart. It is where faith matures into trust. It is where patience blossoms into purpose. Faith says, God will do it. Obedience says, I will wait. And when both work together, life unfolds in alignment with His plan. So tonight, in my stillness, with my blocked nose and tired body, I choose obedience. Because not today does not mean never. It means God's timing is perfect. Obedience over faith. When God says, not today, Iabo Bello, flat D, West London.